I decided to arrive early for Christmas dinner. When I knocked on the door, my son shouted, "Go away, Mom! My fiancé doesn't want you here. Only important people today." I walked away in silence, with class. The next morning, he called me. "Mom, I need the keys to the beach house." I took a deep breath and said 5 words he will never forget. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I stood on my son's front porch at exactly 5:30 in the afternoon, holding a casserole dish that had taken me 3 hours to prepare. The December wind cut through my wool coat, but the cold I felt had nothing to do with the weather. I had been looking forward to this Christmas dinner for weeks, the way I looked forward to any chance to see Porter and try to bridge the growing distance between us. The house looked different somehow. More expensive, new outdoor furniture on the porch, holiday decorations that must have cost hundreds of dollars, everything perfectly arranged like a magazine spread. I wondered how Porter could afford all this on his teacher's salary, but I pushed the thought away. He was 34 years old and capable of managing his own finances. I rang the doorbell and waited, adjusting my grip on the heavy dish. Through the frosted glass, I could see movement inside. Warm light spilled from the windows, and I caught glimpses of other people moving around. My heart lifted slightly. Maybe this Christmas would be different. Maybe Mason would finally accept me as part of the family. The door opened, but instead of the warm greeting I hoped for, Porter appeared with an expression I had never seen before. His face was flushed, his jaw set in a hard line that reminded me uncomfortably of his father when he was angry. But Porter had never looked at me that way before. "Mom?" he said, not moving aside to let me in. "What are you doing here?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I blinked, certain I had misunderstood. "I'm here for Christmas dinner, sweetheart. We talked about this last week." "No, we didn't." His voice was flat, dismissive. Behind him, I could hear laughter and conversation, the clink of glasses, the warm sounds of a family gathering that I was apparently not part of. "Porter, I brought the green bean casserole you always loved, the one with the crispy onions on top." My voice sounded small, uncertain. I hated how desperate I sounded, but I couldn't help it. He glanced at the dish in my hands with something that looked almost like disgust. "Mom, I need you to leave." The words hung in the air between us. I felt my stomach drop, that terrible sensation of falling that comes with shock. "I don't understand. What did I do wrong?" "You just can't be here today, okay?" He stepped further into the doorway, blocking my view of the interior completely. Mazine has worked really hard to make this perfect, and she doesn't want any drama. Drama. As if my presence alone constituted drama. As if wanting to spend Christmas with my only child was somehow an unreasonable request. I thought about all the Christmases when it had been just the two of us after his father died, how we had created our own traditions, our own little family unit that felt complete and whole. "Porter, please, I just want to spend Christmas with you. I won't cause any problems, I promise." From somewhere behind him, I heard Mazine's voice, though I couldn't make out the words. Porter turned his head toward her, and when he looked back at me, his expression had hardened even further. "Go away, Mom!" The words exploded out of him with a force that made me step backward. "My fiancé doesn't want you here. Only important people today. Only important people." The phrase echoed in my mind as I stood there, still holding the casserole dish, still trying to process what was happening. I wasn't important. To my own son, on Christmas, I wasn't important enough to be included in his celebration. I could hear more voices inside now, other family members or friends who had been deemed worthy of inclusion, people who mattered, people who weren't me. I wondered if they knew I was standing out here, being dismissed like a door-to-door salesperson. I wondered if any of them would have spoken up for me. "I'll just go then," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. I wouldn't beg. I had some dignity left, though it felt fragile and brittle in that moment. Porter nodded, already starting to close the door. "That's probably best." I turned and walked back to my car, each step feeling heavier than the last. I set the casserole dish in the passenger seat and sat there for a moment, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. Through the large front window, I could see silhouettes moving around inside. A Christmas tree twinkled with lights, and everything looked warm and inviting and perfect. Everything except for the fact that I wasn't part of it. I drove home in silence, not trusting myself to turn on the radio. Christmas songs would have broken me completely. Instead, I focused on the road, on the familiar route back to my small house that suddenly felt smaller and emptier than it ever had before. At home, I sat in my living room with my own modest Christmas tree and tried to understand where everything had gone wrong. When had I become the enemy? When had my love for Porter become something unwelcome and burdensome? When had Mazine convinced him that his own mother wasn't worth a seat at their Christmas table? I thought about calling my sister Margaret, but she lived 3 states away and had her own family obligations. Besides, how do you explain that your only child has decided you don't matter anymore? How do you put that kind of rejection into words that don't make you sound like a complete failure as a mother? The phone didn't ring all evening. No call from Porter to apologize, no explanation, nothing. I went to bed early, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out when exactly I had lost my son. What I didn't know then was that this moment, this devastating rejection, was about to become the catalyst for discoveries that would change everything. The phone rang at 7:45 in the morning, jolting me from the first real sleep I had managed to get since Christmas night. I had spent the past week in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of my daily routine, while trying to process the reality of what had happened. I reached for the phone, still groggy, and saw Porter's name on the caller ID. My heart leaped with hope. Maybe he was calling to apologize. Maybe he had realized how cruel he had been. Maybe Christmas dinner had made him miss me after all. "Porter?" I answered, probably too quickly, probably sounding too eager. "Mom, I need the keys to the beach house." Not hello, not how are you, not I'm sorry about Christmas. Just a demand, delivered with the casual expectation of immediate compliance. I sat up straighter in bed, suddenly wide awake. The beach house keys? Yeah, for the honeymoon. Mason and I decided we want to spend our first week as a married couple there instead of going to Mexico. It'll be more private, more romantic. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. I pressed my lips together, a strange mix of emotions swirling in my chest. "When is the wedding?" "June 15th. I thought I told you." He hadn't told me. In fact, this was the first I was hearing any concrete details about their wedding plans. "So can you drop the keys by this weekend? Mazine wants to check the place out, maybe do some redecorating before we use it." Redecorating. She wanted to redecorate a house she had never seen, for a honeymoon in a place she had never been, using keys from a woman she had convinced my son to exile from his life. The audacity was breathtaking. "Porter, we need to talk about Christmas." "Mom, please. I don't want to rehash all that drama. What's done is done." He sighed heavily, as if my hurt feelings were an inconvenience he didn't have time to deal with. "Look, I know Mazin came on a little strong, but she was just trying to make everything perfect for our first Christmas as an engaged couple. You understand, right?" No, I didn't understand. I didn't understand how my presence would have ruined anything. I didn't understand why a woman who claimed to love my son would demand that he choose between her and his mother. I didn't understand how the little boy who used to climb into my lap when he was scared had grown into a man who could dismiss me so easily. "She doesn't want me at the wedding, does she?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Porter was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer but no less devastating. "Mom, it's going to be a small ceremony, just close family and really important people. You know how expensive weddings are these days. Close family, really important people." Again, with the message that I didn't qualify. I felt something shift inside me, a cold clarity replacing the desperate hope I had been clinging to. "I see. So, about those keys, tell me something, Porter. Who do you think owns the beach house?" "What do you mean?" For the first time, he sounded uncertain. "I mean exactly what I asked. Who owns the house you want to use for your honeymoon?" "Well, Dad left it to us when he died. It's been in the family for years." His voice carried that same casual certainty that had marked his demand for the keys. I almost laughed. "Almost. Your father left it to us?" "Yeah, family property. I mean, technically it might still be in your name for tax reasons or whatever, but it's family property. Our property. Our property. Family property. Tax reasons." I could almost see the conversation where Mazine had planted these ideas. The careful way she must have framed the discussion to make Porter believe that everything his parents had built belonged to him by right. That I was merely a caretaker, a placeholder, holding things in trust until he was ready to claim his inheritance. "Porter, your father died when you were 12 years old. We lived in a rented apartment until you graduated high school. I bought the beach house 6 years ago with money I earned working double shifts at the hospital and investing every spare penny I could save." Silence. "I bought it so we would have a place to make memories together. I put your name on nothing because I wanted you to earn your own way in life, to build your own success. But I always imagined that someday, when you were ready, we would share it as a family." More silence. "That house represents 15 years of saving, of sacrifice, of working weekends when I wanted to be home with you. I bought it with money that came from selling my grandmother's jewelry, from working holidays when other mothers were home with their children, from living modestly so I could build something for our future. Mom, I didn't know." His voice was smaller now, uncertain. "No, you didn't know because you never asked. You assumed. You let someone convince you that you were entitled to the fruits of my labor without even having the courtesy to wonder where they came from." I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, probably trying to figure out how to navigate this conversation, probably wondering how much Mason knew about our actual financial situation. "Look, Mom, maybe we can work something out, like a rental situation or whatever. Macine has her heart set on that house for the honeymoon." A rental situation. He was offering to rent from me the house I had bought with the intention of sharing with him. The house I had always assumed would someday be part of his inheritance, back when I believed I would be part of his life long enough to leave him an inheritance. "I need to think about this, Porter." "Think about what? It's just for a week. We're family." Family. The word sat heavy between us, loaded with all the irony of recent events. Family. The people who were too important to include me in Christmas dinner were now family when they wanted something from me. "I'll call you back," I said quietly. "When?" "Because Macine really wants to see the house this weekend, and if we can't use it, we need to start looking at other options." The urgency in his voice, the casual assumption that I would accommodate their timeline, the complete lack of acknowledgement for what he had put me through just days before. It was all there, laid out like a roadmap of how little I mattered in his world. I said, "I'll call you back, Porter." I hung up before he could respond, my heart pounding with an emotion I couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was some of that. It wasn't sadness, though that was there too. It was something cleaner, sharper. It was clarity. I sat there in my bedroom, morning light streaming through the windows, and began to see the full scope of what had been happening. This wasn't just about Christmas dinner. This wasn't just about wedding invitations or honeymoon plans. This was about a fundamental misunderstanding of our relationship, one that had been carefully cultivated and nurtured by someone who saw me as an obstacle to be removed. For the first time since that terrible night on Porter's porch, I smiled. After hanging up on Porter, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while my mind traveled back through the years. How had we gotten to this point? When had my son become a stranger who felt entitled to property he had never earned, never even asked about? The answer, I realized, lay in my own choices. In my determination to raise an independent, self-sufficient man, I had hidden too much of my own story. I had been so focused on not creating a spoiled child that I had failed to help him understand the value of what we had built together. It started after David died. Porter was 12, still small for his age, still needing his mother to check for monsters under the bed. I was 38 and completely terrified. David's life insurance had covered the funeral and paid off our small debts, but there was nothing left for the future. We were living in a rented duplex, and I was working part-time at the local hospital. Because I had needed flexibility while Porter was young. The first thing I did was ask for full-time hours. Then I asked about overtime. Then I started picking up weekend shifts. Porter spent more time with babysitters and after-school programs than I liked, but I told myself it was temporary, just until we got on our feet. What I didn't tell him was how many nights I stayed awake balancing our budget down to the last penny. How I learned about investing by checking out library books and staying up until 2 a.m, reading about mutual funds and compound interest. How I started putting away $5 here, $10 there, building an emergency fund that grew slowly but steadily. By the time Porter started high school, I had saved enough to put a down payment on a small house. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom starter home with a yard where Porter could play basketball. I told him we qualified for a first-time buyer program, which was true, but I didn't mention that I had been saving for 3 years to make it happen. When he graduated, I had enough saved to help with college expenses, though I let him believe the money came from scholarships and grants I had helped him apply for. I wanted him to appreciate his education, to work for it, to understand that nothing worthwhile comes without effort. What he didn't know was that I was working 60-hour weeks by then. I had moved into hospital administration, managing supply chains and vendor contracts. The pay was better, but the stress was enormous. I was responsible for keeping costs down while maintaining quality, and I threw myself into that challenge with everything I had. By the time Porter was 25, I had been promoted twice and was overseeing a budget of several $1,000,000 annually. I was good at my job, maybe because I had learned to stretch every dollar in my personal life. I could spot waste and inefficiency in ways that saved the hospital thousands every year. I started investing more seriously then. I bought a duplex and rented out both units, using the rental income to pay the mortgage. Then I bought another property, and another. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention, just solid middle-class rental properties in good neighborhoods. I never talked about any of this with Porter. When he asked how I was doing financially, I would say I was fine, that I was comfortable. I didn't want him to worry about me, and I didn't want him to feel guilty about the sacrifices I was making. The beach house came later, when I was 56. I had found a foreclosure property 2 hours from our hometown, right on the water. The house needed work, but the location was perfect, and I could see the potential. I spent 6 months renovating it myself, learning to tile bathrooms and refinish hardwood floors from YouTube videos. Porter was busy with his own life then, finishing his teaching degree and starting his career. He visited occasionally, always impressed by the improvements I was making, always assuming that somehow this house had just fallen into our laps. I let him believe it because it was easier than explaining the full scope of what I had accomplished. By the time Mazine entered the picture 3 years ago, I owned 4 rental properties and had built a portfolio worth just over $800,000. I was planning to retire in a few more years, maybe travel a little, maybe spend more time at the beach house. I imagined Porter and his future family visiting on holidays, his children playing in the sand the way he had when he was little. But Mazine changed everything. I noticed it slowly at first. Porter started asking different questions about our family finances. Not direct questions, but casual inquiries about property taxes and maintenance costs. Questions that felt like someone else's curiosity being satisfied through him. Then there were the comments about how lucky we were to have family property, how nice it must be to not have to worry about housing costs. Comments that suggested he believed these assets had always existed, had been inherited rather than earned. I started to wonder what conversations were happening between Porter and Mazine when I wasn't around. What assumptions were being made about my financial situation? What plans were being built on foundations that didn't exist? The wedding planning confirmed my suspicions. Mason had very specific ideas about what their wedding should look like, expectations that far exceeded what Porter could afford on his teacher's salary. When I gently suggested some budget-friendly alternatives, Porter brushed off my concerns. "Don't worry about it, Mom. We've got it covered," he said, but I could see the stress in his eyes. The strain of trying to pay for a wedding that was beyond his means. I offered to help, of course. I had always planned to contribute to Porter's wedding expenses. But Mason was quick to redirect any conversation about money away from specific amounts and toward vague discussions of family support and shared resources. It was becoming clear that she saw my assets as Porter's inheritance, available for their immediate use rather than something I had earned and might want to control myself. She talked about our family resources as if they were community property, as if marriage to Porter gave her automatic access to everything I had built. The Christmas rejection suddenly made more sense. I wasn't being excluded because I had done anything wrong. I was being excluded because Mazine saw me as an obstacle to complete control over Porter, and, by extension, over what she believed would someday be their inheritance. She wanted me out of the picture so she could cement her influence over my son. So she could make him believe that his loyalty belonged entirely to her, that his mother was just a complication from his past, rather than someone who might have legitimate claims on his attention and affection. Sitting there in my kitchen, I realized that the phone call about the beach house keys hadn't been about honeymoon plans at all. It had been a test, a way of confirming how much control Mason had established, how completely she had convinced Porter that my assets were really his assets, held in trust until he was ready to claim them. The assumption that I would simply hand over keys to a property worth $350,000, that I would allow them to redecorate it to their tastes, that I would accommodate their timeline without question. It all pointed to a fundamental misunderstanding of our relationship that had been carefully cultivated over months or even years. I looked around my modest kitchen, thinking about all the sacrifices that had built our comfortable life. The overtime shifts I had worked while Porter was in college. The vacations I hadn't taken so I could save for his future. The social events I had skipped because I was too tired from working double shifts to maintain the income that allowed him to graduate debt-free. He had never asked about any of it. He had never wondered how his mother managed to provide so much on what he assumed was a modest hospital salary. He had never questioned the gap between what I appeared to earn and what we were able to afford. That willful ignorance was starting to look less like innocence and more like selfishness, less like trust and more like entitlement. I finished my cold coffee and walked to my home office, pulling out files I hadn't looked at in months. Bank statements, property deeds, investment portfolios, the concrete evidence of 15 years of careful financial planning and disciplined saving. As I spread the papers across my desk, I started to see the situation from Mason's perspective. If she believed these assets belonged to Porter, then my continued involvement in financial decisions would seem unreasonable. My desire to maintain control over my own property would look selfish and possessive. But they weren't Porter's assets. They were mine. Earned through my work, built through my sacrifices, maintained through my ongoing effort and attention. The beach house wasn't family property held in trust for the next generation. It was my property, purchased with my money, maintained with my resources, and if Porter wanted access to it, he was going to have to ask properly. He was going to have to acknowledge what it represented and show some appreciation for the woman who had worked so hard to build something beautiful for our family. The phone rang again, interrupting my thoughts. Porter's name appeared on the caller ID, and this time I let it go to voicemail. I had some thinking to do before our next conversation, and some decisions to make about what kind of relationship I was willing to accept going forward. 3 days later, I was still avoiding Porter's calls when my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, knocked on my door. She lived in the duplex next to mine and had become a friend over the years, one of those comfortable relationships that develops between people who respect each other's boundaries but are always available in a crisis. "Helene, dear, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right with Porter?" she asked after I invited her in for coffee. My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "Well, his fiancée was here yesterday, asking the strangest questions." Mrs. Patterson settled into her usual chair at my kitchen table, looking uncomfortable. "She said she was planning a surprise for him and wanted to know about your family's history in the neighborhood." I poured coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "What kind of questions?" "She wanted to know how long you'd owned this house, whether it had been in the family for a long time. She asked about your work schedule, whether you still worked full-time." Mrs. Patterson paused, studying my face. "She seemed very interested in your finances, dear. Asked if I knew about any other properties you might own. The coffee cup rattled slightly as I set it down. Mason had been conducting an investigation, gathering intelligence about my assets and living situation. The casual nature of Porter's questions over the past year suddenly made perfect sense. He hadn't been curious about our family finances for sentimental reasons. He had been gathering information for someone else. Did you tell her anything? Of course not. I told her she should ask you directly if she wanted to know about your business. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, her expression concerned. Helene, I don't want to overstep, but something about that girl didn't sit right with me. The questions felt calculated, like she was building a case for something. After Mrs. Patterson left, I sat at my kitchen table trying to process what I had learned. Mazine hadn't just stumbled into assumptions about my financial situation. She had been actively researching, probing, trying to determine the exact scope of my assets. That evening, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I had never looked closely at Mazine's social media presence, but I created a fake account and started scrolling through her posts from the past 2 years. What I found made my stomach turn. Her Instagram was full of carefully curated photos showcasing an expensive lifestyle that seemed impossible on her salary as a dental hygienist. Designer handbags, expensive dinners, weekend trips to resort destinations. The dates on many of these posts corresponded with times when Porter had mentioned unexpected bonuses or freelance opportunities that had given him extra spending money. Money that I now realized had probably come from me, filtered through Porter in ways that allowed Mason to spend without feeling like she was depending on her boyfriend's mother. I scrolled back further to posts from before she met Porter. The lifestyle was noticeably more modest then. Casual dinners, chain restaurant check-ins, shopping trips to department stores rather than boutiques. The transformation was stark and clearly linked to when she entered Porter's life. But it was the private group posts that really opened my eyes. Through careful searching, I found references to conversations in a closed Facebook group called Future Wives Network. The posts I could see were vague, but they referenced strategies for dealing with difficult mothers-in-law and maximizing inheritance potential. I couldn't see the full conversations, but the visible comments were enough to paint a picture. There were discussions about property ownership laws, inheritance taxes, and methods for encouraging older relatives to simplify their finances. There were jokes about eliminating holiday obligations and streamlining family dynamics. The most chilling post I found was from 8 months ago, shortly after Porter and Mason had gotten engaged. It was a celebration post about finally getting the ring, with several comments congratulating her on landing the right family and securing the future, not finding love or meeting her soulmate, securing the future. I closed my laptop, feeling sick. This wasn't a case of misunderstood family dynamics or poor communication. This was a deliberate campaign to separate Porter from his mother and position Mason as the primary beneficiary of what she assumed would be his inheritance. The Christmas rejection suddenly looked like a calculated move rather than an emotional outburst. By forcing Porter to choose between his mother and his fiancée during a major holiday, Mason had established her dominance and tested his loyalty. The fact that he had chosen her side so quickly and completely must have been a major victory. The phone call about the beach house keys was the next phase. Having established that Porter would prioritize her wishes over his mother's feelings, she was now testing whether that loyalty extended to financial resources. She was seeing how far she could push, how much she could claim without resistance. I thought about all the times over the past 2 years when Porter had seemed different during our conversations. More distant, more dismissive of family traditions, more focused on his immediate future with Mason than on maintaining his relationship with me. I had attributed it to normal growth, the natural process of a son establishing independence from his mother. I had tried to be understanding, to give him space to build his own life. But now I could see that his growing distance hadn't been natural development. It had been systematic manipulation. Mason had been working steadily to erode the bond between Porter and me, replacing family loyalty with romantic obligation. She had been patient and strategic, never pushing too hard too fast, always framing her requests in terms of love and commitment rather than greed and ambition. The wedding exclusion was the final test. If Porter would disinvite his own mother from his wedding to keep Mazine happy, then Mazine could be confident that she had complete control over him. She could be sure that when the time came to make decisions about inheritance and family assets, Porter would side with her over me. What she didn't know was that there was no inheritance to claim. Porter had never been named as beneficiary on any of my accounts or properties. I had always planned to provide for him, of course, but I had never put those plans in writing. I had assumed we would have years to discuss our family's future, to make decisions together about how to handle my eventual estate. I had never imagined that someone would try to manipulate my son into cutting me out of his life in order to gain access to assets that existed only in her imagination. The next morning, I made an appointment with my attorney. If Mazine wanted to play games with my family's finances, I needed to make sure the rules were crystal clear. When Porter called that afternoon, I finally answered. "Mom, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for days. Mazine is getting really frustrated about the beach house situation. We need to know if we can count on it for the honeymoon. Porter, we need to have a serious conversation about your expectations regarding my property." "Your property?" He sounded genuinely confused. "Mom, we talked about this. It's family property." "No, Porter. It's my property. I own it. I bought it. I pay for its maintenance and taxes and insurance. You have never had any legal claim to it." Silence. "Furthermore," I continued, "I'm concerned about how these assumptions developed. I'm concerned about the influence Mazine has had on your understanding of our family finances." "What are you talking about? Mazine doesn't even care about money." The innocence in his voice would have been touching if it weren't so willfully blind. "Porter, your fiancée has been asking my neighbors about my property holdings. She's been researching my financial situation behind my back." "That's ridiculous. Why would she do that?" "Because she believes you're going to inherit significant assets, and she wants to know exactly what those assets are." "Mom, you're being paranoid." "Am I?" "Tell me, Porter, how much do you know about my actual financial situation? Not what you assume or what someone else has told you, but what you actually know for certain?" Another long silence. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer," I said. "Over the past 2 years, how many of your conversations with Mazine about our family have focused on money, property, or inheritance?" "That's not fair, Mom. Every couple talks about their financial future." "I didn't ask about your financial future with her. I asked how much of your relationship with me has been filtered through discussions about money." I could hear him breathing heavily, probably struggling with questions he didn't want to consider. "You have a choice to make, Porter," I said finally. "You can continue down this path, where your relationship with your mother is defined by what you think you can gain from it, or you can step back and really look at what's happening here." "I don't understand why you're making this so complicated." "I'm not making it complicated, son. I'm making it clear." After I hung up, I sat in my quiet house and realized that the next phone call would determine everything. The call came exactly 1 week later, at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning. I had just returned from my attorney's office, where I had spent 2 hours updating my will and making some very specific changes to my estate planning. The manila envelope containing the new document sat on my kitchen counter, still warm from the printer. "Mom, we need to talk about the beach house situation. Today." Porter's voice carried an edge I had never heard before, a mixture of frustration and something that sounded almost like panic. "All right," I said calmly. "Let's talk." "Mazine and I drove up there yesterday to look at it, and the place is locked up tight. New locks, new security system. What the hell did you do?" I had wondered how long it would take them to make the trip. 2 days ago, I had hired a locksmith and a security company to upgrade all the access points at the beach house. New deadbolts, new alarm system, new electronic locks that required a code I hadn't shared with anyone. I secured my property. "Your property? Mom, this is insane. That house has been our family retreat for years. You can't just lock us out. I can do whatever I want with my property, Porter. That's what ownership means. Don't play word games with me. You know what I mean." I did know what he meant. He meant that he had made promises to Mason based on assumptions about his access to my assets. He meant that someone he loved was disappointed in him because he couldn't deliver what he had implied he could provide. He meant that the comfortable fiction they had built about our family's resources was colliding with the reality of legal ownership. Porter, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I have never, at any point, given you legal ownership of or guaranteed access to the beach house. I have never put your name on the deed. I have never signed any documents transferring property rights to you. The assumptions you've been operating under are completely wrong. You're talking like a lawyer instead of my mother. I'm talking like someone who owns property and has the right to control access to it. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he had hung up. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no less intense. What do you want, Mom? What's this really about? It's about respect, Porter. It's about acknowledgement. It's about the fact that your fiancé has been conducting a background investigation on my financial situation while systematically working to remove me from your life. That's not true. Your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, told me about Mason's visit, about the questions she asked regarding my property holdings and work schedule. Did you know about that? Another pause. She was just trying to understand our family better. By interrogating my neighbors about my finances, without my knowledge or permission? She's going to be part of the family, Mom. She has a right to know about family resources. Family resources. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with all the wrong assumptions and entitlement it represented. This wasn't about family resources. This was about my resources, built through my work, maintained through my ongoing effort. Porter, let me ask you something. How much money do you think I'm worth? What kind of question is that? A simple one. You've been operating under the assumption that you have access to significant family assets. I want to know what you think those assets are. I don't know, Mom. I never thought about specific numbers. Yes, you have. You've been planning a honeymoon at a beach house worth $350,000. You've been talking about family property and shared resources. You must have some idea of what you think you're entitled to. Entitled? I'm not entitled to anything. But you're my mother, and I assumed that someday. Someday what? Someday I would inherit whatever you had built. That's how families work. That's how some families work, Porter. But inheritance isn't automatic. It's not guaranteed. It has to be given freely, by someone who chooses to leave their assets to people they trust and value. Are you threatening to write me out of your will? The question revealed everything. He wasn't calling because he missed our relationship or regretted the Christmas rejection. He wasn't calling because he wanted to repair the damage that had been done between us. He was calling because he was worried about his financial future. I'm not threatening anything, Porter. I'm clarifying reality. You have never been guaranteed an inheritance from me. You have never been named as a beneficiary on any of my accounts or properties. Those are privileges that have to be earned through relationship, through respect, through demonstrated care and consideration. I can't believe you're making this about money. I'm not making this about money, son. You are. This entire conversation started because you demanded access to a property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. You called me to complain that I had secured my own house against unauthorized entry. You're upset because you can't deliver on promises you made to your fiancé about assets that were never yours to promise. That's not fair, and you know it. What's not fair is being excluded from your Christmas celebration and then being expected to hand over keys to my vacation home a week later. What's not fair is discovering that your fiancé has been researching my financial situation behind my back. What's not fair is being treated like a resource to be managed rather than a mother to be loved. I could hear him breathing heavily, probably trying to figure out how to salvage this conversation, how to get what he wanted without having to acknowledge what he had done wrong. Mom, I know we haven't handled things perfectly, but you're blowing this way out of proportion. Mason was just trying to plan for our future together. By planning my exclusion from that future, that's not what happened, isn't it? Tell me, Porter, what role did Mason envision for me in your married life? What place was I supposed to have in your family after the wedding? Silence. Let me guess. I was supposed to be the helpful grandmother who provides babysitting and financial support when convenient. but who doesn't interfere with important decisions or expect to be included in major celebrations. Mom, stop. I was supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you threw my way, while understanding that your real loyalty belonged to your wife and her preferences. You're putting words in my mouth. I'm describing the situation you created when you told me I wasn't important enough to attend your Christmas dinner. The fight went out of his voice suddenly, replaced by something that sounded almost like pleading. Mom, can we please just start over? Can we find a way to work this out? That depends entirely on what you're willing to acknowledge and change. What do you mean? I took a deep breath, knowing that what I said next would determine the entire future of our relationship. I mean that if you want a relationship with me going forward, it has to be based on mutual respect and genuine affection, not on what you think you might inherit from me someday. I never said it was about inheritance. You didn't have to say it, Porter. Your actions spoke clearly enough. I looked at the envelope from my attorney's office, thinking about the documents inside. The new will that left everything to a scholarship fund I had established in Porter's father's name. The updated beneficiary designations on all my accounts. The trust documents that would ensure my assets went to causes I cared about, rather than to people who saw me as an obstacle to their financial security. Porter, I want you to understand something very important. As of yesterday, you are no longer mentioned in any of my estate planning documents. You will inherit nothing from me. The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if the call had dropped. What did you just say? I said you inherit nothing from me. I've updated my will, my beneficiary designations, my trust documents. Everything I own will go to charity when I die. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. I spent 15 years building something I hoped would benefit my family someday. But I've learned that my family sees those assets as their right rather than my gift. So I've chosen to give that gift to people who will actually appreciate it. Mom, please, you're upset and you're making decisions you'll regret. I'm making decisions based on how I've been treated and what I've learned about the people I thought loved me. This is insane. You can't punish me for the rest of my life because of one bad Christmas dinner. I'm not punishing you, Porter. I'm protecting myself. I'm ensuring that going forward, any relationship we have will be based on genuine care rather than financial expectation. What about the beach house? What about our family traditions? What traditions? The tradition of excluding me from holiday celebrations? The tradition of demanding access to my property without showing any appreciation for the sacrifices that made it possible? I don't understand why you're doing this. I'm doing this because I finally understand what our relationship has become, and I refuse to accept that version of love. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling oddly peaceful. For the first time in months, I knew exactly where I stood. I knew what I was worth, both financially and personally, and I knew that I wouldn't settle for being valued only for what I could provide. The phone would ring again, I was sure. There would be apologies and promises and attempts to negotiate, but the legal documents were signed. The changes were made. Porter could have a relationship with his mother based on love and respect, or he could have no relationship at all. But he couldn't have access to my assets while treating me like I didn't matter. That choice was now entirely up to him. 4 months passed before I heard from Porter again. 4 months of peace, of rediscovering who I was when I wasn't constantly worried about managing someone else's expectations or emotions. 4 months of sleeping well, of making plans based on my own desires rather than on family obligations that were never truly reciprocated. I had retired from the hospital in March, finally ready to enjoy the financial security I had worked so hard to build. I spent my days reading, gardening, taking long walks along the beach. I had started volunteering at a local literacy program, helping adults learn to read. It was satisfying work, meaningful in a way that felt entirely my own. The beach house had become my retreat in the truest sense. I spent weekends there, sometimes inviting Mrs. Patterson or other friends to join me. I had redecorated it exactly to my own tastes, finally free from the need to consider what someone else might want or expect. When Porter's call came, I almost didn't answer. His name on my caller ID brought back a familiar tension I had been enjoying the absence of. but something in me wanted to hear what he had to say after all this time. Mom? His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, less certain. Hello, Porter. I was wondering if we could talk. In person, I mean. I know I don't have the right to ask, but I was hoping you might give me a chance to explain some things. I considered this carefully. What things? What happened with Mason? What I learned about myself? What I want to do differently going forward? Where is Mason now? A long pause. We broke up 3 months ago. The engagement is off. I felt a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction, but I kept my voice neutral. I'm sorry to hear that. No, you're not. And you shouldn't be. You were right about her, Mom. You were right about everything. We met at a small cafe downtown, neutral territory that didn't carry the weight of family history or property ownership. Porter looked older than his 34 years, tired in a way that suggested he had been doing some difficult thinking. He waited until we both had coffee before speaking. I need to tell you what happened, and I need you to know that I'm not telling you this because I want anything from you. I'm telling you because I owe you the truth. I nodded, waiting. Mason left me the day after you changed your will. Apparently, she had been in contact with someone at your attorney's office, trying to get information about your estate planning. When word got back to her that I was no longer a beneficiary, she said there was no point in continuing our relationship. She told you that directly? She told me that she had been counting on financial security that was apparently never going to materialize. She said she couldn't afford to marry someone who was going to have to support his mother in her old age rather than inheriting from her. I almost laughed at the irony. Mason had been so focused on Porter's potential inheritance that she never realized I was perfectly capable of supporting myself. She also told me about the research she had been doing on our family finances. She knew about the rental properties, the investment accounts, all of it. She had been planning our entire financial future around assets that she assumed would eventually be ours. Porter stared into his coffee cup, his shoulders sagging. I was so stupid, Mom. I let her convince me that you were being possessive and controlling when you were just trying to maintain ownership of things you had earned. I let her make me believe that your desire to be included in our lives was somehow unreasonable. Why are you telling me this now? Because I spent 3 months being angry at you for ruining my relationship, and then I spent another 3 months realizing that you didn't ruin anything. You just revealed what was already there. He looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Genuine remorse, not the frustrated apology of someone who wanted something, but the deep regret of someone who truly understood what he had lost. I've been thinking about Christmas every day since Mason left. About standing in that doorway and telling my own mother she wasn't important enough to be included. About making you stand there holding a casserole you had made for us, while I rejected you like you were a stranger. It was a very painful night. It was unforgivable. I know that. I know there's probably no way to fix what I broke. But I needed you to know that I finally understand what I did. We sat in silence for a while. I studied my son's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. I had become very good at spotting those things over the past year, but what I saw was exhaustion and genuine shame. What do you want from this conversation, Porter? I want to apologize, really apologize, not just say sorry so things can go back to the way they were. I want you to know that I understand why you made the decisions you made, and that you were protecting yourself from someone who was treating you badly. Someone. Me. I was treating you badly, Mom. I was so wrapped up in trying to make Mason happy that I forgot to consider whether what she wanted was reasonable or kind. I let her turn me into someone who could look his own mother in the eye and call her unimportant. I felt tears threaten, but I held them back. This was what I had hoped for. What I had dreamed of during those lonely months after Christmas. But it was also coming too late to undo the changes I had made. I appreciate you saying this, Porter. It means more than you know. Is there any chance we could try to rebuild something? Not go back to the way things were, because I know that's not possible. But maybe find a new way to be mother and son? I considered this carefully. What would that look like to you? It would look like me calling you regularly because I want to hear your voice, not because I need something from you. It would look like me including you in my life because I value your presence, not because I feel obligated to. And what about the inheritance situation? I don't want to inherit anything from you, Mom. I want you to live a long, happy life and spend every penny on yourself. I want you to travel and enjoy your retirement and not worry about leaving anything behind for anyone. You might change your mind about that someday. If I do, then I'll have learned nothing from this experience. Your money belongs to you. It always did. I had no right to assume otherwise, and I have no right to expect it now. We talked for 2 more hours. About his work, about my retirement plans, about small daily things that had nothing to do with property or money or inheritance. It felt strange and tentative, like learning to walk again after a long illness. When we parted, he didn't ask when he could see me again. He didn't push for immediate forgiveness or rush to schedule our next meeting. He simply said he was grateful I had been willing to listen, and that he hoped someday I might be willing to trust him again. Over the following months, we began to rebuild. Slowly, carefully, with clear boundaries and honest conversations. Porter called every Sunday, not to ask for anything, but to check on my health and share news about his life. He sent birthday cards and holiday greetings that focused on his love for me rather than on family obligations. He never asked about my will or my estate planning. He never mentioned the beach house or the rental properties. When I offered to help him with a car repair bill, he thanked me but declined, saying he needed to learn to handle his own financial challenges. It took almost a year before I felt comfortable inviting him to visit me at the beach house. He came for a weekend, bringing groceries and cooking dinner for us both. He didn't comment on the redecorating I had done or ask about the new security system. He simply enjoyed the time we spent together and thanked me for sharing my space with him. The night before he left, we sat on the deck, watching the sunset over the water. "Mom, I need to tell you something." My heart clenched, wondering if he was about to reveal another manipulation, another hidden agenda. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, "not just for what you built financially, but for standing up for yourself when I was treating you badly. It took courage to set those boundaries, and I'm grateful you did it." Why grateful? Because it forced me to become someone worth having a relationship with. Someone who could value you for who you are, rather than for what you could provide. I reached over and took his hand, feeling the calluses from his woodworking hobby, the solid warmth of my grown son's palm. "I love you, Porter. I always have. I love you too, Mom. And I promise you, I will never again treat that love like something I'm entitled to, rather than something I need to earn every day." As we sat there in the growing darkness, listening to the waves crash against the shore, I realized that I had gained something more valuable than any inheritance I could have left behind. I had gained a son who chose to love me not because he had to, not because he hoped to benefit from it, but because he genuinely valued who I was as a person. It had taken losing everything for both of us to find what really mattered. And for the first time in years, I knew that whatever time I had left would be spent with people who truly wanted me in their lives. That was worth more than all the property and investments I had ever accumulated. It was the real legacy I had been building all along. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.